All right. Let's go ahead and kick off. My name is Adam Scamahorn. I am the product director for Cloud at Intervision. I've got little over 12 years of experience in disaster recovery as a service, backup and business resiliency practices as a whole. I started out kind of leading the team that does the delivery of our disaster recovery as a service today, and I'm now the product manager who owns that as well as other cloud offerings. I've got a lot of time actually architecting disaster recovery environments, building out solutions, and kind of working through those things. So I'm going to share some information with you that will hopefully be helpful as you're thinking about how you're implementing disaster recovery practices and also maximizing the return on investments when you're taking those resiliency efforts into play. So do a quick agenda here today. We're going to give a quick history lesson, kind of talk about where we got, how we got to where we are today when it comes to disaster recovery, and then where disaster recovery plays in comparison to things like high availability as you're balancing resiliency in your IT needs. Talk a little bit about modern threats that kind of come out of that history lesson that we'll start with. And then the challenges when dealing with architecting disaster recovery for modern cloud environments, and all the things that come into play as things go into a more modernized environment. Then we will talk a little bit about designing and what needs to go into that solution, as well as give some real world disaster recovery use cases. There's all kinds of negative things out there about, oh, this happened and this organization lost this much money and reputation was down. We're going to tell some real positive stories instead and show where disaster recovery can actually be incredibly successful when it's implemented correctly. So with all of that said, I'll give you a little history lesson on disaster recovery. The idea of backup and DR has been around since the late 70s, and back then this was basically tape backups of mainframes. You know, the idea of recovery time objectives and recovery point objectives really hadn't evolved yet, but there was a need for the ability to have some kind of resiliency. And then as computing grew and personal computing grew as well, you started to see an evolution on not just the cost of downtime, but the requirements for organizations to maintain uptime. And so in some cases, governing bodies got involved and started compliance frameworks and requirements that needed to measure disaster recovery a little differently. Virtualization changed the landscape pretty heavily in the early 2000s as larger adoption of things like VMware came into play and allowed organizations to use things like storage replication as well as virtual machine replication to implement disaster recovery. And as cloud computing took off, this became a much more cost-effective way than owning two data centers to run your disaster recovery, and utilize something that was much more elastic and much more capable, and organizations began to adopt disaster recovery frameworks that utilize those cloud technologies. So that continued to grow, and organizations moved more and more towards high availability models that allowed for really, really fast, if not non-existent recovery time objectives with active-active or active-passive kind of HA setups. And then while cybercrime had always been an issue and one of the major concerns for disaster recovery, we really saw that idea of cybercrime for profit explode around 2019 to 2020, and then evolve continuing through the COVID years as it changed the threat landscape. And so what we're really going to talk about today as we've come into 2024 is a balanced approach of high availability and disaster recovery being necessary as a primary and effective way to build resiliency for workloads, both on-premise and in the cloud. So you've got to have both. We talked about HA and disaster recovery. If you want to be protected, you're going to need both. Let's level set what we're talking about when we talk about HA and disaster recovery. When we think about high availability, what we're really talking about is the idea that we're eliminating single points of failure, right? So you're dealing with components that are active, often in multiple regions, sometimes geographically load balanced, but they're always on. There's some network connectivity between them, and lateral movement is possible in those environments. Disaster recovery is all about utilizing technology to recover from a specific incident. And so it's much more focused on what is my recovery time objective, or what is my recovery point objective. And so these are both kind of important, and we'll talk about why, to address and mitigate potential risks. One of the biggest things I want to call out is high availability is really, really good at providing constant uptime and reducing the risk from geographical failures, things like natural disasters. But when it comes to issues like human error or cyber attacks, it really falls short, because often the problem that happens on one side of a high availability design is going to be replicated and reproduced on the other side, whether that's a human error, a code push, or it's a cyber attack and the attacker moves laterally across and hits the other side of whatever high availability architecture is in place. And so it's really important to have both of these to build resiliency. Talk a little bit about the modern challenges. And what we saw in 2020 is, like I said, I've been doing this a while, is the evolution of ransomware attacks became the number one form of disaster. And this is the one that most organizations are focusing on. We saw this exponentially be much, much higher than any other reason organizations were declaring actual disasters. We've responded to things like hurricanes or citywide power outages or problems with technology. But if you take all of those other problems and you put them together, they don't even come close to the number of disasters that we see and respond to that come from ransomware attacks. That was the number one specific thing that we ran into. The other components, though, that do need to be considered, and they definitely still play a part in that disaster, is the idea of technology failures, business email compromise, also on the cyber attack front, natural disasters, backup failures, and human errors. On top of the idea that disasters drive a disaster recovery platform, there's also business drivers like compliance, insurance, legal requirements, and just in general, the cost of downtime as a business driver. Modern disaster recovery pain points. So we talked about why you would need a disaster recovery environment, but there's all kinds of complexity in organizations' IT environment that are going to cause some struggle in actually adopting some kind of a disaster recovery plan. The first and foremost is what every organization has in common, and it's that no organization has anything in common. There's always going to be something unique about one organization's IT stack over another. There is almost always a non-standard element that has to be considered because it's really important to the organization. And so that is something that has to be developed, usually separately from any kind of out-of-the-box software that exists, because of its uniqueness when you look at an overall disaster recovery solution. The second is just general resource constraints. Candidly, disaster recovery often falls to the bottom of the budget priority list if it's not an actual problem right then. And on top of that, disaster recovery can cost a lot in human capital. So this is something that often the people who work for organizations are not as focused on as they are their day-to-day tasks and evolving and building strategies for the future. Next is testing. Going along with that human capital, there is a huge, huge cost in running and delivering disaster recovery tests to make sure that your actual disaster recovery plan works. It's one thing to replicate servers into another environment, build an ability to rehydrate them in a cloud environment. It's a whole nother thing to actively test that, make sure that it's not impacting production, make sure that end users can test the applications and the security team has access, and the compliance team has access, and all of those things are in place for actual disaster recovery. And finally is the idea of disaster recovery for the modern cloud. As organizations have modernized and moved to things like containers or serverless environments, it's become much more difficult to utilize any kind of a software as a service platform for disaster recovery as a service. And that's because of the way cloud and modernization ideas work. And so you've got to build newer processes and procedures for looking at the way that those code updates happen, and making sure that you've got a way to isolate and implement disaster recovery plans for code development in those specific types of scenarios. So I want to give you some things to consider, help you kind of think about how you solve some of those problems, at least at a very, very high level. Here's kind of 7 key things to consider. And you'll notice 3 of these 7 things are all around disaster recovery testing. As I mentioned on the problem slide, testing is really crucial to all of this. And I want to kind of step back and highlight that one last time of saying the things that you practice, the things that you do over and over again are the things you're going to do well, whether that's hosting a webinar or performing surgery. If you've never done it before, you're not going to be good at it. If you've done some practice, and the more you've done it, the better you will be. The same goes with performing an actual live disaster recovery, handling things in a live incident response. So the first one of those testing components is regular testing with end users. That's one thing for an IT team to rehydrate machines, make sure it powers on and say, it works. But it's a whole nother thing to make sure the network connectivity is there, the user access control systems are there, and that the applications actually run. And so that is key to making sure your organization can actually recover, is making sure the end users can access the applications that they would need for your organization to run. The second is doing actual scenario-based testing. And I'll share some, like I said, I'll share some live examples of real recovery. And we'll talk a little bit about some different scenarios and how those recoveries took place and what the outcomes were. But no disaster is going to be the same. And so you need to have plans that basically have tested different ways to handle different types of scenarios. The way an organization responds to a power outage is not going to be the same way an organization responds to a cyber attack. And so developing different response plans for those different things and actually testing, this is the way our team implements this type of scenario recovery, is key to the test plan as well. Incident response integration is right next to testing. And this was key to us as we kind of evolved through that 2019, 2020 timeframe, where we went from recovering from the more natural disaster, human error type of incidents to actually taking care of clients through incident response of an actual cyber attack. And so this is key to making sure that when you bring an environment back up, it can not only meet your compliance requirements, but you can also make sure that the team has looked for indicators of compromise and cleaned anything in that recovery environment before you're turning it back on, before you're putting users back into a recovered environment, and make sure that it is sterile and that it is protected from whatever got in the first place. And so those security team members need to be part of the plan, part of the scenario-based testing, and actually involved in the overall plan development. The next one is frequent and thorough evaluations. You've got to be able to repeat these tests. This is a heavy human capital concern. And so being able to validate the effectiveness simply and repeatably and update the plan effectively quickly is key as well. So building the plan, building the templates, understanding what has to be done each time. And then the next bullet's key to making that happen in a repeatable manner is using some kind of automation, improving the recovery time and reducing errors by automating what happens when a disaster recovery takes place. You probably don't want to automate absolutely everything. It's pretty important to have people who can make decisions in those places. But as artificial intelligence evolves and modernization capabilities and scripting continues to enable us to make things happen faster and better when we're doing our testing. This one's kind of crucial across the recovery landscape, but it's the idea of the 3-2-1 backup strategy. Having several copies of your data, having multiple copies in multiple locations, at least 2 locations. And I want to stress the 2 locations piece, because we see a lot of software services indicating recovery in place, recovering back to production. And that's a fantastic idea from a cost standpoint. The problem is when we run across most disaster recovery scenarios, it's usually not an option. In the case of a natural disaster, often there's no data center there, or not at least a powered on data center to recover to. But in the event of a cyber attack, even if the source data center is there, it usually can't be wiped out. Once legal is involved, once insurance is involved, that environment has to go through a set of investigation material that will make sure they know everything they need to know before they can power off that production environment. And so often there's not enough room in production to bring back 2 copies, because you're already running the production environment, bring back a secondary copy there. And there's also all kinds of network concerns and security concerns about having that on the same storage and the same hosts. And so having a off-site location where that can be recovered is key. And then that takes us to the advanced backup methods. On top of following the 3-2-1 options, you want to also make sure that you've got the ability to have an immutable data repository for those backups and some kind of logical air gap, so that attackers are not able to move between production and the disaster recovery site. There's different user access controls, there's different networks involved, and nothing's on the same network plane or logical plane at all. Finally, I want to talk a little bit about leveraging disaster recovery experts. And one of the analogies I like to use here when we're talking about disasters is, if my house is on fire, it's fantastic if my neighbors show up with hoses and buckets of water and try and help me put it out, but I'm really going to want the fire department to come. So you want to be able to have actual experts who have trained, practiced, and done actual disaster recovery, firefighters who've put out real fires, who are helping you focus on disaster recovery. And so where it's possible to leverage a disaster recovery service provider, you can leverage not only their elastic cloud resources, so you're not paying for always on powered data center, but you can also let your own people focus on more core business objectives and allow that service provider to take care of the core needs of the disaster recovery piece. And like I said, you're gaining expertise and support that otherwise you really can't hire the kind of staff that comes with a service provider who's got that level of real world experience. So let's talk a little bit about some of those real world stories. I've got 3 kind of high level case studies, and you'll notice there's no names attached to these, because when organizations experience this kind of cyber attack that I'm going to talk about, they're not going to want to put their name out there. And we'll talk about, though, the outcomes and why this is so much easier as we reach the end of this. The first one of those is pretty interesting. This is a distribution company that was doing business in the Ukraine, or still is doing business in the Ukraine. But at the time of Russia's invasion, the very night that Russia invaded, they got hit with a ransomware attack. Now, I can't actually prove who perpetrated this specific attack, but the attack matches what was happening there in waves. And we saw a lot of this right in that same time frame. In this instance, they were unable to process any orders. Their entire data center was compromised. And once we were able to identify what had happened, we were able to pause their disaster recovery replication. We've got our own processes and pieces in place where we can go back in time and look and see exactly when the virtual machines were encrypted. In this case, there was a ransom note, and we're with the security team, able to determine where the attack vector was, how they got in. And so in the disaster recovery site, they were able to bring everything up from before that, run the appropriate scans from what was identified as the indicator of compromise, clean off the environment, and plug the hole, essentially, to make sure that when they powered everything back on, they were able to turn it over to the end users very, very quickly. And in this instance, there was a security team brought in to do forensic analysis on the production environment, just to make absolutely certain that all of the details were captured and we can eliminate any threat for this client happening again. The second story I'm going to tell you is about a retail organization. This one's pretty cool because really nobody knew they were down. This happened right after midnight. The organization was hit with a ransomware attack that hit a specific business unit that held all of their online retail records. And due to their own backup schedule, this organization's previous method would have been rolled back to the previous backup, which happens right at midnight. They thought they lost an entire 24 hours of retail sales. I couldn't put a financial number on that for you, but I mean, losing a whole day of sales for any organization is going to be pretty painful. And so by implementing their disaster recovery plan, again, we were able to go back just minutes before the actual encryption happened, recover, isolate, clean, and hand the environment back off to the organization very rapidly. And this retail organization was able to start business the next morning just as normal. And most of the people in the organization did not even know this happened, including members of the IT team that were not involved in the disaster recovery, had no idea until someone told them, that the disaster recovery had been implemented and what had happened with the ransomware attack. Last story I'm going to tell you is about a legal firm. Excuse me. In this scenario, it's a little bit unique from the first two. Again, it was a ransomware attack that took the organization down. They did actually have some ability to recover in place. They were able to isolate their production environment that was attacked, put it in a sandbox, run forensics on that sandbox, and while that was happening, begin to recover on other hosts and other storage that they had available in production. Problem is, they didn't have enough. It wouldn't all fit. So working with our disaster recovery team, they built a plan to bring up their 3 large file servers in their cloud disaster recovery environment, but their application servers and user access control and everything else was brought up in their home data center. And so they actually ran in a hybrid cloud model for about 2 weeks with the file servers that they needed in the cloud and the rest of their production environment back on prem. And once the forensic piece was done, once they were able to delete everything that had been corrupted by the attacker, they were able then to perform a migration of those file servers back out of cloud. And all they paid for in that instance was the cloud consumption of those file servers for a couple of weeks, which I can tell you from experience, their insurance company was much happier to pay for a couple of weeks of cloud consumption than they would have been to pay for a ransom. So there's 3 really positive stories. Each one of those was recovered in about an hour. In fact, the file servers, once the plan was in place, the 40 terabytes of file servers were brought up in that disaster recovery environment of the last story in about 10 minutes. So that's one of the big stories I want to leave you with today, is this idea that Intervision's recovery time is significantly faster than the industry standard. Our average across the board is about 1 hour. The industry standard in the United States is a little over 3 weeks. That means on average, we're about 100 times faster, 3 weeks specifically from a ransomware attack. And that makes us about 500 times faster than the national average. There's a lot of things here listed on how we do it, but I want to kind of highlight the fact that one of the things Intervision does really differently is the idea that we test with organizations. A lot of disaster recovery as a service will actually set up a solution, set up monitoring, hand you the keys, and allow you to build your own plan. So with our disaster recovery as a service, it comes with essentially a virtual disaster recovery expert that helps lead you through that plan build, through that first disaster recovery task, measuring your recovery time objectives, recovery point objectives, and build a plan to actually make sure you're hitting your goals. And then continues to task throughout the year, certifying your environment that it's ready for recovery. And through those tailored strategies, we're able to make sure that we are solving problems for the most unique components that every organization has. And with all of that said, I'm going to open it up for questions. I see a couple things that have dropped into the chat. Let me see here. So the first question I see is, what lessons have you learned from previous disaster recovery events that have helped improve your service? It's a really good question. Let me just say one of the biggest lessons, and we talked a little bit about the timeline of evolving from performing disaster recovery mostly from like a natural disaster or human error type event and moving into more cyber attack. When that first happened, the very first real ransomware event, when a security team was kind of brought in to work with the disaster recovery team, one of the things we learned was we should never power off the source machines, which was counterintuitive from a team that was all designed to bring up new environments as fast as possible. You don't want the production environment messing things around. You kind of turn everything off and clear that off. But the forensic team from the security team actually needs to kind of sandbox that off and run their technology to make sure they get every bit of logs from the memory dumps and know everything that's happening in that environment. And so while isolating that environment from disaster recovery is key, not getting rid of that and allowing the security team to kind of do their role. And so in doing that and working with them back and forth, we kind of built a cadence where the two teams became one team for incident response going forward. And it helped us build a solution we call RPAS, or ransomware protection as a service. So that allows us to combine our expertise from our security teams and our expertise from our disaster recovery teams to offer a solution that is able not only to prevent most attacks, but very rapidly recover when and if something gets in and causes a problem. So I would say it's kind of a twofold answer. One, we learned about how that production environment needs to be treated in a security environment, but we also learned how to work better with security teams and have made that part of our daily practice. Any other questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. I think we're almost at time, but I see one more. It says, can you share some performance metrics and uptime statistics for your DRAS service? Yeah, absolutely. And honestly, probably the one I'm the most proud of is that 500 times faster than the national average. That's probably the key. Everybody's got their recovery time objective goals, and a lot of organizations have specific SLAs around that. We do too. But when it comes right down to it, you can have an SLA around it all day long, but we've got a lot of experience around not just hitting that SLA, but blowing it out of the water as being very, very fast to not only respond, but also to recover. Last question I see says, can you explain the key differences of Intervision's DRAS versus our competition? Yeah, and let me go back to that slide actually. The biggest thing I would say is the people, and every MSP is going to say the people, right? But as I said at the beginning, I've led the team that offers this service going back over 12 years ago. And a lot of that organization was there even before I was, and most of them are still there. You don't see that a lot in an IT organization. And these people really, really like being the superhero that swoops in and saves the day. And their ability to build really complex solutions and processes and weave them into a tailored strategy for every organization is hands down our biggest differentiation. On top of that, I would say our ability to combine disaster recovery with security and turn it into a cohesive solution. So ransomware protection as a service, again, is a big differentiator for us as well. Well, I don't see any more questions, so I think we'll wrap up there. We're about 1 minute after. I want to thank everyone for your time today, and we'll be posting this for everyone else. Thanks, everyone.